All right, guys, so this is our very last Colonial America lesson for this whole unit, and tomorrow you're going to be taking your test. So we have a lot to do, but lucky for you, I think it's going to be pretty fun. We're going to be learning about the Revolution. And if any of you, I want to ask to see if any of you have actually thought about what that word means. Do you know what the word revolution means? Do you think you could explain it to somebody? Revolution means a lot of people trying to overthrow the rule of government and start a new one. So it's when they decide they don't like their government and they want to change it. And that's what happened with the colonists. And we learned about this during our social studies unit, but today we're going to have a much more in-depth lesson about the Revolution. And we're actually going to have two read-alouds that I'm going to break apart into two videos. So the first video is going to be The Road to Revolution Part 1. I'm going to read that from our reader here. And we're going to fill out this activity page 14.1. And we're going to practice noticing the cause and the effect of different things that happened at the beginning of the revolution. And then we'll have a second read aloud where we're going to learn about the actual revolution and some of the big events that happened. So it's a lot of listening today, but you don't have to watch the whole two videos at once. You can break it up. You can watch one on one day and one on another day. It's up to you. Okay, so we're going to get started. You have learned about how the English colonies were established and how the colonists lived their lives. Throughout this time, the English, Spanish, and French fought each other over land in North America. They were land hungry and clashed over the areas of North America they wanted for themselves. The Spanish had forced the French out of what is present-day Florida and gained control of it. The Spanish also moved into the areas of North America now known as New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Texas. The French were colonizing parts of present-day Canada and had also claimed the Mississippi River Valley for France. Whereas some of these land claims resulted in wars on European soil, other clashes were beginning to take place in North America. As the colonies grew, English explorers continued west across the Appalachian Mountains to what is now, the Ohio River Valley. However, this land was not uninhabited either. Native Americans had been living in this region for a long time, some of them having been forced to move west away from the eastern regions to escape the influx of settlers. The French had also claimed a few areas of the Ohio Valley. The French had established a good trading partnership with various native tribes in the area. They didn't want the English settlers to interfere with this business relationship. Neither the Native Americans nor the French wanted English settlers to build homes upon this land. However, members of the British Parliament wrote to the French and told them that it was a well-known fact that the land belonged to Great Britain and they should go away. The French considered this request and then replied, "No." This was a bad sign. Conflict was brewing. The Native Americans, distressed by how much land they had already lost, steeled themselves for a fight, and so did the French. Yet another war broke out in 1754. This war is known as the French and Indian War. Fought in the forests of North America, this war went on for a very long time, almost 9 years in all. Colonists in North America were asking to fight for this land. Britain also sent thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic Ocean to fight. Many Native Americans in the region, such as the Huron, fought with the French in this war. Others, such as the Iroquois, sided with the British. 2 years later, the war was over, and colonial territory in North America spread to other parts of the world, where France and Great Britain competed for land, such as Europe, the West Indies, and India. This phase of the war is known as the 7 Years' War in Great Britain. Eventually, after much conflict, the British captured the French-controlled city of Quebec, Canada. The capture of Quebec in 1759 was a turning point for the British, who eventually won the war. In 1763, the war was over, but this was the beginning of the end for French fortune in North America. Although the French and the British signed a peace treaty, the Native Americans did not. Organized attacks on British settlers continued under the leadership of Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa tribe. These assaults, commonly known as Pontiac's Rebellion, actually involved a vast network of at least 13 Native American tribes, which united together. The British soon realized that it would be impossible to defend this land or the settlers on it. As a result, the British Parliament and King George III decided that settlers could not live on land west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1763, King George issued a proclamation forbidding it. Can you imagine? Having just fought a war for ownership of this land, colonists were now told to stay away from it. Fighting a war for many years is a very expensive thing to do. When it was over, the British Parliament realized that they had spent a great deal of money. Britain was in financial trouble, and someone had to help get Britain out of it. That someone was the 13 colonies. The Prime Minister of Great Britain at the end of the French and Indian War was a man named George Grenville. Grenville was asked to come up with a plan to pay off Britain's debt. He thought long and hard about this, and did indeed come up with a plan. How about taxing the colonists, he thought to himself. After all, Great Britain fought the war to defend the colonists against the French and the Native Americans. Grenville presented his plan to King George III and Parliament. Everyone in Britain agreed. It was a great plan. In 1764, the British Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This law placed a tax on foreign sugar and molasses. By making foreign sugar and molasses more expensive, the colonists were being forced to buy these goods from the British producers in the West Indies. However, this act did not just include sugar. It also included wine, cloth, coffee, and silk. The colonists were now taxed if they chose to buy less expensive products from other nations. Then in 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act stated that all printed materials produced in the colonies would be taxed. Newspapers, magazines, legal documents, and believe it or not, even cards would cost more. People were required to buy a stamp and place it on the paper item they had purchased. In the same year, the Quartering Act was passed by the British Parliament. This meant that colonists had to help provide quarters, or temporary places to live, for the British soldiers stationed in the colonies. The colonists also had to provide supplies, such as food, bedding, candles, and firewood. For many years, the colonists had handled their own affairs. Now, members of a government 3,000 miles away had voted to tax the colonists. The colonists were not allowed to vote for these British leaders, so they felt their views and thoughts were not represented in the British government. Many colonists believed that it was unfair that they had to pay taxes, but did not have representation in the British Parliament. The British responded that members of Parliament considered the interests of the entire empire, and not simply the areas they represented. Although most people had accepted the Sugar Act and the Quartering Act, they were not prepared to accept the Stamp Act without a fight. Some outspoken colonists began to suggest they should not pay it. They cried, "No taxation without representation!" Okay, so that's the end of our read aloud. Not too long, right? And now we're going to take some time to fill in this cause and effect thing on activity page 14.1. So the very first thing that happened was the Wampanoag and the English settlers battle. And what happened, the cause for this, why did they start battling, is because Europeans settled farther west and the Native Americans decide to take a stand. What I mean by take a stand is they got tired of all these colonists coming and taking their land, and they said, we have to do something about this. And what happened because they decided to take a stand? What was the effect? The effect is that Chief Metacom led his people on attack. The settlers eventually won. Okay, remember the British won the French and Indian War, which I guess this was slightly before the French and Indian War, but the settlers won. Okay, so then we have the French and Indian War, and this started because of a lot of reasons, but one of the causes was that Native Americans and French did not want English settlers taking their land. Okay, and what happened because of this? The Native Americans and the French fought together against the British. Native Americans and French fought together against British. Let's say the British won. Okay, so now let's go to the next page here. The Great Britain was in financial trouble. They didn't have a lot of money. Why didn't they have a lot of money? Let's find out. They were fighting a war for many years and it was expensive. Sorry, that looks weird. Let's fix that. Okay. And what was the effect? What happened because the war was expensive? The let's just say Britain, decided to tax the colonists. Okay. Now, the Stamp Act, sometimes it's confusing when you hear Stamp Act because you think that they were taxing the colonists for stamps, but actually it was much worse than that. They were taxing them for anything, any kind of paper that they bought. So like, imagine you buy a card for your grandma and you have to pay extra for it and then get it stamped proving that you paid extra. That's what they had to do. So the colonists were not happy. Why did they start the Stamp Act? A law taxed the colonists on all printed, let's say all types of paper. That's what the Stamp Act was. And the effect was colonists believed it was unfair and did not want to pay it. Okay, that wasn't so hard. So we've got these 2 pages. You can pause the video if you need to copy them down to write what I wrote. And then when you're ready, either now or later, please watch the second part of my read aloud to find out what happens next. And let's see how this story ends. All right.